like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. Well, we're delighted to welcome back James Cotton to the ACT branch of the Institute, where he is a long-term member indeed. His chosen topic is Adventures in Representation in Japan and External Affairs First Fatality. As on previous occasions, James has spoken here. We can look forward to a revealing presentation. What for me and many others may be an unfamiliar chapter in Australia's diplomatic history. Now, for the one or two of you who may not know, be aware of James's background, let me give some brief highlights. He's had a long attachment at ADFA, where he is Emeritus Professor, as well as appointments at Princeton and at the Woodrow Wilson Centre for International Scholars in Washington, where he was the Australian Scholar in 2009. His Australia and the World 1920 to 1930 and Australia and the World 1931 to 1936 were published in the Documents in Australian Foreign Policy series in 2019 and 2021, respectively. His most recent book is The Australians at Geneva, Internationalist Diplomacy in the Interwar Years. When did that come out, James?
2022.
2022. All right. Now, James will speak for 40 minutes tonight and then take questions. If we run out of time, he's willing, I'm sure, to take some questions from in-house participants at least afterwards. And we aim to finish at 7 p.m. So let me hand directly over to James.
Well, thank you. We've got the microphone on. That's good. Well, thank you for turning out on a chilly night. Those of you who are missing Antiques Roadshow, I can't guarantee that this is an Antiques Roadshow because, of course, both the presenter and the events are not quite 100 years old, but it will certainly be a vintage roadshow. Okay, that's our subject. This image, in fact, is the seal of the mission prepared by Keith Officer in 1940, and it's actually now in the National Library of Australia. Next slide. Well, that's the mission assembled in December 1940. They're at a reception at the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo. I'm going to come back to that and talk at some detail about some of the individuals. Let me just dwell, though, on John Latham. Here, John Latham, the head of the mission. Next slide, please. Well, now, John Latham, a bit of a curious appointment. I mean, he had a day job as the Chief Justice in the High Court, but he had had a long interest in diplomacy. He'd been with Hughes at the Paris Peace Conference. Later on, he'd gone into Parliament, and he'd been Minister of External Affairs and Attorney General in both the last Bruce Page government and also in the first Lyons government. But more particularly, in 1934, while still External Affairs Minister, he'd undertaken what was described as a goodwill mission, which was a tour around various Asian countries. But the real objective of the mission was to go to Japan. Next slide. And there he is over here in Japan in 1934. And he's at the Shuhogahara Foreign Cemetery in Kobe. And the reason he's there is because he's paying his respects to the remains of John Bligh Sutor. And this is an indication that our story actually has much longer history than is appreciated. There were various Australian officials, or officials from Australia, one should say, in Japan before Latham. The most long-served of them all was Sutor. Sutor was commercial representative for New South Wales in Japan from 1903, end of 1903 to 1922. And in fact, liked Japan so much that he stayed on in Japan and died in Japan in 1927. There he is. That's a bust of him up the top there. That's a more recent photograph. There's no bust anymore because, of course, during the war, the Japanese melted down pretty well everything that they could find made of metal, including John Bly Suttor. But his grave is still there. Next slide, please. Now, Suttor was working for the government of New South Wales, but he did a number of things for the Commonwealth. We can't go into the details, but here you see a document that indicates that Suttor is empowered to give to bona fide Japanese students, tourists, and business figures the right of entry to Australia so that they are not obliged to undertake the dictation test. Because, of course, if they were obliged otherwise to undertake the dictation test, they would have to sit it in Serbo-Croatian or something and then be prohibited from entering the country. That was the general rule. So he was also doing work for the Commonwealth. We need to bear that in mind. There were yet other people in Japan at various times, but and including some really colourful ones, but time forbids me to tell you any stories about them. Okay, next slide. One of the outcomes of the Eastern Mission was the recommendation from Latham that Australia appoint trade commissioners, and in particular trade commissioners in Asian countries, and the very first and most important location for those trade commissioners should be in Japan. And so we made the decision to appoint Eric Edwin Longfield Lloyd, generally referred to as Longfield Lloyd, as our trade commissioner in late 1935. Now, Longfield Lloyd, in fact, was a mate of Latham's. He'd been in military intelligence, just like Latham in former times, a Gallipoli veteran. And Longfield Lloyd had a rather unhappy time in Japan because, of course, he was a trade commissioner. He was really the principal Australian official in Japan, but yet he had no diplomatic status. We hadn't negotiated with the Japanese a kind of reciprocal arrangement. There were a lot of Japanese consular officials in Australia. They were there even before Federation, and they were given quasi-diplomatic status, including the right to import goods and personal goods and so on and so forth. There was no such relationship, though, in terms of the status of Latham in Japan. So even getting his personal goods through the customs when he arrived in 1935 was a nightmare. And famously, a bit later on, he found that he had to pay duty of 5 yen on a stuffed koala brought into Japan to place in his office. This led to a great flurry of paper, both with Australia and with the guy Musho, the Japanese foreign ministry, but I'm afraid to say without too much positive result. Also, no sooner had he arrived there than we had this trade dispute with Japan, the trade diversion episode. You're running a trade surplus with a country. What better to do than place high tariffs on the goods that they're sending you? I mean, that would have to end well, wouldn't it? Well, of course, you can imagine the result. Japan had been the biggest buyer of Australian wool up until that time. The bottom dropped out of the wool market and so on and so forth. But we can't deal with that. Longfield Lloyd, as I say, carried on until 1940, but really, despite the fact that the Australian government changed his title from Trade Commissioner to try and emphasise his national status, he was never really taken all that seriously by the Japanese. Next slide. Well, let's now pass on to the mission. Why it was that the mission was sent and what kind of Japan they were likely to encounter when they arrived there. We had already sent a head of mission, a minister, as they were then called, to Washington. We'd sent a high commissioner to Ottawa, and Japan was our third choice. But the Japan that they were heading towards was a very different kind of Japan to the Japan that Latham had experienced in 1934. Remember, once the Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937, increasingly Western countries became more and more stringent in their criticism of Japan, and this had considerable effects on their bilateral relations. Interesting story, this one. July and August 1940, the Japanese police rounded up a whole lot of British residents in Japan, some of them people who had been there for many years. One of them was a man called James Melville Cox. Melville Cox was the Reuters representative in Japan. After 2 days of questioning by the Japanese police, his body was found in the courtyard of the building where he was under investigation. It's not clear to this day whether he committed suicide or whether he was murdered, but in any case, he was dead. Interestingly, the British government later on paid his widow a very considerable sum of money. The figure I've seen is £5,000, but I can't check that right now. But it was a very considerable sum of money. So the story that he might have been also working for MI6 is certainly a possibility. So this was the kind of Japan that was being contemplated. And remember too, in the course of 1940, the alignment of the Japanese with the Axis powers became more and more obvious. And in September of that year, the Japanese signed what was called the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and with the fascist Italy. Now, it was a defensive military pact, but it seemed to be an indication of the direction that the future world conflict would take. And in fact, having made the decision, yes, we want to send a minister to Japan, the Australians were then in a bit of a quandary because the British wanted them to go slow on this initiative because they said, look, this is going to send the wrong kinds of signals. And in the end, we had to insist, no, we're going to send this person, we're going to send these people. And in fact, of course, because the British mission in Tokyo was our conduit for any contact with the Japanese government, this raised some difficulties. Anyway, those were all surmounted. Okay, let's have slide 8. Now, there's Latham on his way from the temporary Australian Chancery in Tokyo. We used the Trade Commissioner's office, which was in the process of being shut down. We also acquired other property, but it was all terribly temporary. But you can see the Australian coat of arms on the gate. He's heading off to the palace to bow to the Emperor. No handshaking, only bowing, and present his credentials. And then he became, of course, officially Minister Plenipotentiary, which was his title. And this was done within 4 days, in fact, of his arrival in Tokyo. So it was done very quickly. And importantly, he was a minister, not an ambassador. Our view in those days still was that you couldn't appoint an ambassador to a capital which was already the residence of a British ambassador, because Her Majesty's government, of course, could only have one ambassador. It would have to be the British ambassador. We changed that idea in 1947, but up until that time, we appointed ministers rather than ambassadors. Okay, next slide. So there they all are. And let me just take you very quickly through them and then say a little bit about them. Pat Shaw, Keith Officer, Mr. Saito, Latham, Mr. Tanaka, I'll come back to him, Albert Hard and Tom Eckersley. This gentleman here, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu was a prince of the Tokugawa house, you know, the former shogun family, former shogun's family. He'd been ennobled in the new dispensation in Japan. The reason he's there is because he was actually consul general in Sydney in the 1920s for 4 years. Interesting fact. Okay, starting with Pat Shaw. Pat Shaw, Melbourne University graduate, had done various jobs for the government, already a rising star in the government's External Affairs Service, did 2 tours in Japan, served in many other posts, ended up as ambassador in Washington, one of our most important figures from that generation. Of course, he was knighted for his services along the way. Keith Officer, the next figure, really our original diplomat. He served almost everywhere. He even got the better of Everett. Everett used to send him from one hardship post to another, thinking that he might get rid of him. But no officer thrived when other people were wilting and falling by the wayside. He spent so much time in foreign missions of one kind or another. He rarely lived in Australia after 1933, and ended up, of course, with a knighthood and living in Britain. But durable, interesting, dependable, not the sharpest tool in the shed, but probably a very safe pair of hands for that kind of job. We have Latham. Then we have Albert Hard. He was a veteran trade official. He had been Longfield Lloyd's assistant towards the end of the period of the Trade Commission and had made the move into external affairs. Tom Eckersley. Tom Eckersley, another graduate of Melbourne University in languages, but a bit of an unusual person. In the 1950s, he really became the principal Japan specialist in the department. He'd won the Mollison Scholarship in 1935, and most winners of the Mollison Scholarship, they would go to France or they would go to Germany to improve their European languages. No, Eckersley decided to go to Tokyo, and he spent almost a year in Tokyo and acquired serviceable Japanese and then proceeded to work on his Japanese. And interestingly, when he came back to Australia, he could see that the only people in the Australian government service interested in Japan were the trade people. So he joined trade from external, thinking, oh, well, they'll send me to Japan, but then discovered that they weren't going to do that. Then news of the mission in 1940 was announced. So he went to see Hodgson, Roy Hodgson, the secretary of the department, crusty old fellow, another Gallipoli veteran, asking to join the department, rejoin the department, because after all, there was his Japanese expertise. Surely they would want it. And Hodgson famously said, no, we're not having you back. You're disloyal. You left the department. So anyway, fortunately, smarter people prevailed. Latham got to hear, let's say, of Eckersley's expertise. They had an interview. Then Latham directed Hodgson, appoint this person as third secretary and language officer, which Hodgson immediately did. And you see who was in charge there. Later on, these people were joined by a couple of others. Bernard Cuskey became another language officer in May 1941. Bernice Campbell was sent from Australia for secretarial duties. Now, I'm dealing with, okay, the people sent from Australia. Next slide. There's one missing from that photograph, and that's this guy. And this guy is Harry Frame. Now, got to say some more about Harry Frame. Harry, born in Nagasaki. He's on his way to the Anzac Day March. He's got his medals on. You can see here, he's got the Distinguished Conduct Medal. In those days, the next decoration to the Victoria Cross, the first Distinguished Conduct Medal ever awarded to somebody in the Australian military forces. A very interesting guy. He was at Gallipoli, but more on him later. Next slide. But like in China, so in Japan, actually, locally employed staff were very important figures, particularly in these early days. Remember, most of those people were sent, never been to Japan before. You know, if their Japanese extended to konnichiwa, that was pretty good. So people who could be intermediaries played an important role. Now, this is a bit of a long story, but I'm going to mention Mabel Ellison here. This is a little newspaper story from January 1940. She's just going back to Japan. She, at that stage, was working in the trade office as private secretary to Longfield Lloyd. Remember the guy we saw earlier on? Born in Prospect, South Australia in 1890. She had gone to Japan In 1918, she'd married a guy called Montague Ellerton, and thereafter lived in Japan pretty well the whole time. And in fact, interestingly, even after the war, she actually went back to Japan and she died in Japan years later. So she was obviously somebody who not only identified herself closely with Japan, but was, happy enough to live there. She spoke Japanese very well, but Montague Ellerton, even more remarkable, her husband after 1918, he had been born in Japan in 1884 in Tokyo. He was in business. He was completely fluent in Japanese. And clearly these people opened all the doors that would have been shut had their expertise not been available. There were yet others. It's a long story, but I think the locally appointed staff played a really important role in this mission, and accounts of this period really should acknowledge their role. Now, look, I can't resist just showing you this one. Next one. This gentleman here is Paul Gore Booth, later on Lord Gore Booth and head of the British Foreign Office. As a young man, he was an officer in the British Foreign Service, posted to Tokyo. That's his smiling wife in 1938. Her name is Patricia. She was born in Japan, and her parents were the Ellertons. So, wheels within wheels. But what's interesting and significant, we kind of think, oh, well, these people were going to Japan, it's an unknown. But in fact, there were a whole lot of people with Japan expertise. The government wasn't actually terribly good at using it, but there were a whole lot of people. Jim Jameson, for example, who joined the department after the war, had actually gone to Tokyo in 1931, again as a Mollison scholar, and was living in Tokyo at the time that the mission found its way to Japan. So there were actually more people conversant with things Japanese than perhaps we like to recognize. Okay, I don't want to go on too long. How are we doing? Next slide. They had to find some premises. That was the next job. This rather nice abode was the temporary accommodation for Keith Officer. Latham also stayed there while they were looking for a more permanent residence. Next slide. And this is the building that they finally acquired. I'm sorry about the quality of these snaps, but it kind of conveys the period. This is Keith Officer's scrapbook, by the way. This is this is copied from. Now, this house was built by Marquis Hachisuka. It was built in a kind of European style in the 20s. It had been the Polish mission in Tokyo for quite some time. They'd rented it. But after the demise of the Warsaw regime, as a result of the invasion by the Nazis, government in exile couldn't afford the rent, so they had to move out. Officer got to hear about its availability and acquired the lease. Fast forward to the present, the grounds of that building are still the Australian Embassy in Japan today. And in fact, when I first visited that embassy, I think, Garth, it was in 1982 to have a chat with you, that building was still there. It's since been demolished. Some of the land has been sold. There's been a whole lot of new construction and so on, but some of the garden features are still there. A very wise investment. Nice part of Tokyo, just around the corner from the Keio University. Yes, we did wonderfully out of that transaction. And interestingly, when we bought it, as opposed to leasing it, we bought it using reparations funds, so it actually didn't cost the Australian taxpayer anything. Okay, let me say just one or two things about conditions at the time, bearing in mind that this property wasn't actually the Chancery and the Ambassador's accommodation until quite late in the piece. Let me read you something that Eckersley wrote a little while after the the time in Japan, which might amuse you. He said, he wrote an account of that period. He said, the fact that 2 of the diplomatic staff of 4, of whom one, Keith Officer, was a bachelor and did not count statistically, arrived in Tokyo with clearly pregnant wives, when the staff of the American embassy had already evacuated some of their wives, and when the British were contemplating the same action, created a positive impression in the diplomatic corps in Tokyo. We got to bear in mind, that these were dangerous times. In an early letter to the colleagues in the department, Shaw says, at the end of our street, and at most street corners in Tokyo, is a placard about 6 feet by 2 advertising a Down with England meeting to be held on the 25th of January. And just picture this, the 2 junior members of the department, pregnant wives, finding accommodation in distant suburbs. They are then required to spend all of their time in the Chancery and actually spending a huge amount of time coding and encoding, which was a terribly cumbersome and time-consuming task at that time. Eckersley had to argue even to get 2 hours off every day for a language study. The wives were left in these suburban houses, having to travel by tram or bus, crowded because everything was in short supply in Japan, at a time when there was an active government campaign alerting all Japanese to the fact that foreigners couldn't be trusted and were potential spies. These were brave women. This was a difficult and dangerous post. And of course, it got more difficult as the year rolled on. I could tell you some more stories, but I don't have the time. But just to say, the point of no return was kind of reached in about July 1941, when the Japanese military occupied southern Indochina, and when the Americans, as a result, cut off oil supplies to Japan and also obstructed any further Japanese financial transactions through American banks. So all kinds of things suddenly became in extreme short supply, and whole economy was disrupted. And in another letter later on that Shaw writes to his colleagues, he says, the food situation worries me, not for myself, because I like fish and rice, and because boarding school and boarding house life has made me capable of eating almost anything that is put in front of me, but for Helen and the child. And Judith and Janet, both born in Tokyo, in the Eckersley and Shaw households. Judith, the very first child born in an Australian mission overseas. And I'm hoping she's listening to us right now. Happily, she is still with us, as is Janet. Some more stories, but no, we'd better press on, except to say that there had to be some decision made after August, because clearly war's going to happen. What are we going to do with the families? Eckersley decided no, Trixie and Judith should leave, whereas Pat Shaw said no, I think family should stay. So Trixie and Judith Eckersley left on one of the last ships actually leaving Japan, because almost all of the shipping lines had shut up shop. Latham left too. Now, Latham hadn't been all that well, but he'd worked very hard. Eckersley was impressed with him, according to his account. But there was a British cabinet minister coming to the Far East and going to Singapore, Duff Cooper. Latham wanted to find out at first hand what was going on, because he could see that war was coming. So he was on the same ship. But when he got to Singapore, he was quite ill. He was then admitted to hospital. He had a major operation. It was then decided that he was too ill to go back to Japan, and so he was sent back to Australia. Officer then became charge and moved into the Hachizuka house. The chancery was established there, and there was some consolidation of the properties that the mission controlled. Okay, let me come on to the next slide. I want to tell you a bit more about Harry. How are we doing? Good. There's Harry. There's his daughter, Gracie. He's on his way to the Anzac Day March. Harry, like I say, born in Nagasaki, 1880. His father, William, a ne'er-do-well from Melbourne, then teaching in a school in Japan. Formed an association with this lady called Kitagawa Sei. Their union was recognized by the Japanese government. One of the very first, and it's documented, interestingly, but he forgot to tell them that he already had a wife and children in Australia. Harry's father died within a year of his birth. Harry's mother then remarried to a man called Koba, who was an aristocratic person. She was herself an aristocratic person. Her father was a minor court official. He then raised Harry, and they had other children in Osaka. Harry went to quite a respectable school in Osaka. As a teenager, though, he ran off to sea. He was a seaman, travelled all around the world repeatedly on many voyages, found his way to England in 1906 and married a British woman in Middlesbrough. He may have been a mercenary in Latin America, but it's not clear. The documentation is disputed. First visited Australia in 1911, came here to live in 1912, joined the AIF in 1914, off to Gallipoli 1915. A legendary scout, C.E.W. Bean, thought he was one of the most brilliant people in the whole Gallipoli operation. Eventually, he was badly wounded and repatriated. Harry then had a bit of a difficult life. He was a soldier settler, but like a lot of soldier settlers, you know, not enough land, wrong place, all that kind of thing. He worked very hard at it. But in a place called Kentucky in middle west New South Wales. But he was in debt, and by that time he had 2 children to worry about. War broke out. He went to see his friends in the military. He had many connections because of his Gallipoli service. He went to work for military intelligence. His job was to infiltrate Japanese circles in Sydney. There were more than 100 Japanese residents in Sydney. There were also a lot of representatives of companies and so on and so forth. Half of them at least were spies, and it was Harry's job to find out what they were up to. Well, then a most unfortunate development. Let me just, by the way, show you this quickly. Next slide. Harry's boss in military intelligence was WJR Jack Scott, later famous for the Ambon Sparrow Force fiasco. But I was just desperate to get D.H. Lawrence in here, so now I am, because he was the model for Jack Calcott in D.H. Lawrence's Kangaroo. And in fact, recent scholarship indicates that actually Lawrence engaged with Australians much more than has been thought. And so it's pretty likely that Scott was indeed the model for Jack Calcott. Old guard, fascist, and a terrible officer at Ambon, but had won the Military Cross and the Distinguished Service Order, Gallipoli, Somme, all that kind of thing. Okay, next slide. So this is Hodgson, Secretary of the Department. He was the one who superintended all the appointments. And here comes a twist in the story, because this newspaper report appeared in a number of newspapers about Harry's appointment as interpreter and manager of Chancery. And it says, where is it? Now doing special defence work. Now doing special defence work. And Scott was beside himself when he saw this appear, because he knew that the Japanese would now know that Harry had been engaged in intelligence. And to make it even worse, Hodgson actually discussed Harry's appointment with the Japanese Consul General. How this all happened, a bit of a long story, and perhaps I can answer some questions on this one. But the thing is, as a result of this, Harry's a marked man. Okay, next slide. That's the RSL magazine from 1931. How many Asiatics were on the cover of the RSL magazine between the wars? Harry was the only one. Here he is here again. This is a photograph taken in Sydney, and interestingly, that's Longfield Lloyd, because he knew Longfield Lloyd quite well. They'd been in Gallipoli together, and Longfield Lloyd may have been the source of the information that was passed to Hodgson, that there was somebody in the works who might be a suitable person to be an interpreter. We know that Scott gave Harry's information to Hodgson, but we also know that Scott explained to Hodgson that under no circumstances should his work for defence be revealed. Well, what happened? Harry arrived there in early December, was staying in the temporary chancery. According to Eckersley, he was having a hard time of it. His spoken Japanese undoubtedly was very fluent, but diplomatic communications in those days written in a highly technical, abbreviated form of Japanese that even educated people would find difficult reading. So whether how good he was at that, we can't be sure. But on the 21st of January, 1941, he seems to have been the subject of an attack in the streets of Tokyo. He was admitted to hospital on the 4th of February. After tests, trying to discover how he'd lost his voice, why he couldn't swallow, eventually they decided he's too sick, we better repatriate him. He was sent back to Australia. He died on May the 27th. Now, he didn't tell anybody in the mission, but he told his family and his friends, I was the subject of a garroting attack on the streets of Tokyo. And I think the evidence for that is pretty clear. Then there was a most unseemly to-do, because I'm sure Hodgson didn't want to have anything to do with him. When his second wife, he'd remarried, his first wife had died, got in touch with the government saying, well, look, surely his service can be recognised and I can be given some support. I've got 2 children whose maintenance I've got to worry about. In the end, they gave her a solatium of £50. Harry's property was sold up and his mortgage was discharged and there was nothing left. Next slide. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, because of his role in Gallipoli, the military historians have got hold of him. And let's face it, the trope of a latter-day samurai in the Australian forces in Gallipoli is irresistible. How could you not write that? But these writers too, I think, without sufficient evidence, want to say that Harry was also engaged in intelligence work in Japan. I don't think that's the least bit credible. After all, his cover had been exposed. And moreover, even the British had to shut up shop after the murder of Melville Cox. Even they weren't able to sustain a spying outfit in Tokyo. The Russians were, but the Sorga spy ring was in operation. But Sorga had the perfect cover. He was a Nazi newspaper man, and he had about 40 people helping him, including 2 teams of people sending his radio messages. Harry would have had nobody. So the idea that he was spying, I think, is not true. Next slide, next and last slide. Yeah, we're on time. What happened to the rest of them? Well, war's declared. Official from the Foreign Ministry turns up, wants to search the premises, and they're burning the codes and so on. They're all concentrated in the Hachisuka residence. Fortunately, a shipment of supplies had just arrived from Australia, so they actually had enough to eat. But then months and months of negotiation, because under the conventions, you see, if you're diplomatic personnel, you have the right to be repatriated. And the Japanese were very happy to observe that convention because there were a whole lot of Japanese that they wanted to have repatriated to Japan. So in the end, this ship, the Tatsuta Maru, took them all and a whole lot of others. Initially 11 Australians that had been rounded up in Korea and Japan, but more as they stopped in Shanghai and Saigon and Singapore. So by the time they got to Mozambique in Portuguese Africa, it was a neutral Portuguese ship, there were something like 129 people in this party, officer and his staff looking after them. They went to South Africa. Officer and his people were responsible for feeding them and clothing them and looking after them and arranging for a repatriation ship to Australia. However, last twist in the story, officer disappeared, found a berth on a British warship and skipped off and left them. And as Helen Shaw says in her memoir, officer was very slick. I said he was usually first in line, for himself particularly. He sneaked off and got on board some kind of British warship, which was going to Australia from Cape Town, and he just said goodbye and left Pat in charge of the lot. And here was Pat with a pregnant wife and a baby. They got back, but it wasn't until November that they arrived in Melbourne. The party was then about 89 people, and in fact, most of them wrote this very nice letter to Eckersley, Shaw, and Kusky, saying how wonderfully they'd been treated and how respectfully and how much obliged they were to them and the Australian government for taking care of them. Now, postscript, then almost immediately, Eckersley, Kusky and Ellerton all went into the Royal Australian Navy Voluntary Reserve. They became paymaster lieutenants, and they either worked on code breaking or they worked on intelligence. Because their Japanese expertise by this time was recognised. The country was actually rationally organising the expertise that was available to it behind the war effort. Well, with that, Heath, I'll stop. And yes, as I say, happy to answer some questions if you have any.
Thank you. About 20 minutes, so do people have any points of question that they'd like James to follow up on? Self-explanatory, yes.
I'd just like to say I worked in the Australian Embassy in Tokyo for 40 years in the Defence Attaché. I knew a fair amount of the history. I had no idea of these sorts of early histories because really the whole process effectively started after the war, 47 and thereabouts. So I'm very grateful for the insights, first of all, Chief given me.
Oh, good. Well, there's a very fine book edited by David Lowe and Kate Darien-Smith about the Australia-Japan relationship, but there are a couple of chapters about the mission, the grounds, the history of its use, and so on and so forth. But they really begin after the war. And this early period they only mention very briefly. Whereas, in fact, yes, it does have quite a rich history. And there are even more characters, one could bring in with more time. I mean, there was another lady, Mabel Rawnsley, for example. She also lived in Japan. Her husband was also in Japanese business. She also went to work for the mission. She also spoke Japanese. There were yet other people who were pulled in at various times. So, in fact, like in China, people who are often not particularly acknowledged, but actually played an important role.
Fascinating. I understand that at the Royal Military College Duntrine in Canberra in the up until the late 1930s, Japanese was taught as a language.
Yeah.
Mysteriously, it stopped in the late 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any rationale behind that, given the fact that a lot of this external affairs and trade was clearly seen as the benefits of Japanese?
Yeah.
Why was the army not?
Okay. Well, look, hard to give a short answer. Okay. I'll try. Edmund Pisa, in those days running military intelligence in Australia, clearly, this was during the First War, he could see the importance of information about Japan because even then, Japan was on the radar as a future antagonist. He said there ought to be teaching of Japanese in Australia. He convinced the government to help fund a post in Japanese at Sydney University. They appointed a man called James Murdoch, originally for a lectureship. He was then later on made a professor. In fact, Murdoch, a very serious scholar of Japan, had already published 2-volume history of Japan and was writing a 3rd volume. Murdoch spent half of his time in Sydney teaching Japanese, half of his time in Duntroon, teaching cadets Japanese. He also recruited over the years 5 different Japanese who spent various periods of time in Australia up until 1928, teaching Japanese not only at Duntroon, but also at Fort Street High School. Because, of course, Japanese studies in the university required a feed-in of people under the university statutes of those days. You really had to do a language at high school level before you could do a language at university. So there was a certain amount of teaching of Japanese at Fort Street High School. And some of the people who were taught Japanese then, Broadbent, Capes, but most importantly, Eric Nave, later on became major figures in Australia's military establishment for their expertise on Japan. The whole thing petered out in the 30s, partly because Duntroon was shut down. The whole military college was moved temporarily to Sydney, partly because money was much tighter, partly because there was an individual who was already teaching other languages in Duntroon who kind of took responsibility for Japanese as well. Yes, it was a bit of a lost opportunity. But I mean, there we were with Jim Jamison, for example. Later on, very important figure in the department. Surely somebody must have known. Not only did we have somebody in 1939 who had studied in Japan, he was even working for, Japanese university and also doing translating. There was also Peter Russo. There were a few others, but we didn't really make very good use of the Japanese expertise that we had. But yes, that whole Duntroon period is very important. Some people say that Pisa was a spy master and that Murdoch was spying for Australia. Well, he certainly brought sensitive information back from Japan. He made these yearly trips to Japan, which were paid for by the government. But I don't think you could say really seriously he was a spy. But certainly he was an important conduit of information for the Australian government.
Oh, first.
Thanks, James. John Quinn, XD, but thanks for that great talk. Like Peter, I was in the embassy in Tokyo and I never heard the story. Just a quick question in terms of the focus on trade. You mentioned the role of key players in trade with Japan. Clearly, one issue I think you've written about is, post Versailles, this vision that people had opportunity in Asia, and people like Vivian Bowden, of course, was commissioned in Singapore, executed by the Japanese on Bankers Island. But say a bit more about other people who might have played a role in advising government about Japan. Presumably Bowden, who grew up in Japan, might have had some role in that conversation as well.
Yes, well, of course, Bowden had been a principal of a Japanese company. And in fact, one of the reasons it took so long to repatriate the people who were in the Hachisuka house holed up there was because one of the conditions the Australian government wanted to establish was that Bowden should be repatriated. The Japanese pretended that they didn't know where he was, whereas in fact already he'd been executed, and they didn't want to admit that. And so they said, "Oh, he's missing. We have no information about him," which was not true. Oh yes, a whole lot of people got involved in the idea of Japanese trade. I mean, Clunies Ross, for example, was an early enthusiast for trade with Japan, made repeated trips to Japan. There was an Australia-Japan Society. In fact, Latham was the president of it in the period after he ceased to be External Affairs Minister. There were a number of other individuals, Professor A.C.V. Melbourne in Queensland, who wrote a major report on Australia's economic relations with Asia. Famously, he said, there's got to be direct trade routes, there's got to be direct transport. Australian banks have to be able to work with Asian currencies, with representative branches in Asian capitals. We have to take seriously the kind of reputation that our immigration policy has, so on and so forth. In fact, pretty well all of the recommendations of the Garneau report, sometime later, are to be found in Melbourne's recommendations of 1934. So, wait a minute, 1933, I think, yes. It's a very lengthy report and very sensible. And in fact, there was even some talk at one stage of Melbourne being the person appointed as Trade Commissioner. But Latham preferred somebody from the military side, and so Latham had the say. It's a bit of a lost opportunity. No, there were a whole lot of people. There were a whole lot of people, and see, even Jack Scott, who we saw there, Jack Corcott in Kangaroo, he was a bit of a Japan enthusiast in the early 30s. Made a number of trips to Japan, including trips paid for by the Japanese government. Went to Manchuria, said it was wonderful. Later on, went cold on Japan. But yeah, no, there were a number of people in that category. Yeah.
As Ward Councillor, thank you very much, James.
Mm.
You've mentioned Eric Nave a couple of times, and I have to admit my only knowledge is from Ian Fenningworth's book, Man of Intelligence, which is very good. Eric was a remarkable figure. And what you're telling me is that some of the people from the mission came back via South Africa, were commissioned into the RANVR, and then worked presumably at Fromel in Melbourne, in which case they may well have been involved in some of the code breaking that
Yes,
led
yes,
to the interception of the
Yes,
Japanese
yes,
fleet heading for Port Moresby.
That's right.
In May 1942,
Oh, yeah.
intercepting the Battle of the Coral Sea. But you interest me because the usual reason for the Navy agreeing to commission people was because they knew they were deploying them into the field as coast watchers under Operation Fernando the Bull, the silent one. I mean, we commissioned a couple of people there who were at risk because of where they lived, and we wanted to give them a fighting chance of not being executed as spies. It didn't actually work. There were any number of commissioned officers who were executed. But are you telling me that these people who came out of the mission in Japan were only used in Fromel and Melbourne, or did they actually go forward to be, coast watchers?
They certainly weren't coast watchers. I think two of them ended up in Brisbane. One stayed in Melbourne. Yes, but doing military business. But of course, as you know, that period still, it's a bit of a puzzle exactly what people were doing and where. But it was certainly the case that, I mean, literally they arrived, and on the docks, the Navy people were there saying, we're going to call you up. So the Navy people knew exactly that their expertise was crucial and it was going to be used for the war effort.
Halsey said that the coast watchers saved Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal saved the Pacific.
Quite right. Yeah.
Yes, the back there.
I was really interested in Frame himself, and was there any sort of follow-up either in Japan, any sort of examination of what the attack involved? I mean, we've all seen so many crime shows.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a rock kind of movie?
Yeah.
Did anyone care?
Well, the whole thing was ropey, but his problem was he was admitted to hospital. Now, it was the Western hospital, but by that time, all the staff were Japanese. And he was in the hands of Japanese doctors. And as he formed the reasonable assumption, not unreasonable assumption, that somebody was out to kill him, he wasn't going to tell the story to any of them. But what makes it ropey and suspect is when he came back, he was admitted to hospital, he died. He told this story to all his friends and his family. His death certificate says he died of cancer of the gallbladder. Now, this is a rare condition, and you cannot determine that somebody has died of cancer of the gallbladder unless you perform an autopsy, and there was no autopsy performed. In other words, this was a convenient but obscure condition that was put on his death certificate so there would be no further inquiry. And my interpretation is that Hodgson and others became well aware that they were the ones who had placed him at risk. They therefore did not want to put themselves under any responsibility. So they wanted to sever the relationship between him and the government. It's a very unhappy story. I mean, what's interesting, you see, here's Longfield Lloyd, his mate from Gallipoli, by that time in charge of the Commonwealth Security Service. So somebody extremely well connected, Longfield Lloyd even goes into bat for him and corresponds with Hodgson and talks to this one and talks to that one. There's a big paper trail out there on this. No, can't shift them. Nothing to do with us. We'll give her 50. We'll give her £50. Now, bearing in mind he was paid quite a generous salary by the standards of the time, £400 a year, but I mean that represents only a tiny proportion of the income that he'd been paid. So it's a very unhappy situation. But it seems to me, just in the State Department, see, you've got this wall that has the pictures of all the people who were killed in the service. And we have, for ourselves, people who were killed in the service one way or another. A lot of people would say, oh, Bowden would have been the first, killed on Banker Island by the Japanese. I think Harry should be there. He died in May. War hadn't broken out yet. Bowden was still alive in Singapore. So Harry should really be the first one on the wall. But we don't have that wall yet. We should have.
Know who beat or who made a gap?
Well, it was Hodgson who'd mentioned this to the Japanese Consul General, of all things. It may then have found its way into the newspapers by way of them. But it was widely reported because this was a syndicated item and it was in most of the Australian newspapers. Yeah, amazing.
James, you mentioned Eckersley, and he later became very well known in the department indeed in terms of knowledge about Northeast Asia and Japan in particular. But I just wonder, what do you feel might have been the formative influences that he obtained on that posting in Tokyo that came with him through his career? Is it possible to speculate on that?
Well, he ended up, of course, at the ANU and wrote actually, it's a very interesting, I've read it, so it's a really interesting manuscript on Japan. The arrangement was he was going to write this book about Japan. For one reason or another, he didn't complete it. It's rather a pity, though, because I think it's really a really competent study. I think he had some professional differences and ended up working in immigration. But he wrote the most amazing autobiographical letters series. I was lucky enough, the family were kind enough to let me see the ones relating to this period, and they are full of stories about the activities of these people. So many details that, if you had the time, you could go through it in more elaboration.
All right, last question, Paul.
Thanks, Kenna. Sorry. Officer, who sounds to me a bit like an Arthur Daley character. Did he suffer any opprobrium for his skipping off like he did?
Well, no, you see, Officer was a chap. OBE, MC, very well connected. Stanley Melbourne Bruce was a personal friend. He was a friend of Casey's. He was a friend of Hodgson's. He was in a different division to all those other people. I mean, Shaw and Eckersley, I mean, they were the coming men, but they were only third secretaries. And of course, by the time they get back to Australia, the war's on, focuses on other activities. And meanwhile, Officer has been shot off to further work, you see. So, and in fact, what happens is Everett decides that, he'd be just the perfect person to open in Russia. So he goes off to Russia, except, of course, that the mission's not in Moscow because the war's on. So it's in what was then called Kuibyshev, or was now called Samara, and was called Samara before, which is in the middle of nowhere, with shortages of every kind. But whereas all kinds of leftists and communists turned up in the baggage of the Australian mission in Kuibyshev, none of them lasted the distance. Whereas Officer, who famously used to ski every year and so on, the story was even told that he set off from Kuibyshev one weekend doing cross-country skiing, and the two KGB people who were ordered to shadow his every movement dropped by the wayside because they couldn't keep up. So he was a remarkably durable figure, hugely self-confident. But But yes, if you read his diary, I've read his diaries. Lots of interesting information there, but it reads a bit like Boy's Own, you know. Lunch with Reginald, splendid chap. Skiing on the weekend, boating on Tuesday, things like that. It's not terribly forthcoming, but the deeper currents of diplomacy. Yeah.
James, we might draw a line under it there, and it's been another fascinating set of insights into a relatively unknown period of Australia's diplomatic history. It's always a treat to have you back. Personally, hoping that you might come back next time and tell us a bit about the Dutch East Indies and Australian people in trade in that part of the world before the Second World War. But in the meantime, if we could join, thank you.